Organizers to introduce Reinhold Esterbauer from the University of Graz. He is a professor for philosophy at the Catholic Faculty of Theology in Graz. He has worked a lot in phenomenology, philosophy of religion, especially I'd say in phenomenology of religion, with a focus on different topics that range from questions concerning the concept of the holy, the concept of forgiveness, but also the question of emotions, the question of religious language and things like that. So a vast array of issues pertaining to the heart of phenomenology of religion, but also is interested in interdisciplinary research, as is proven by a recent interdisciplinary research project on body time was the title, and it was an attempt at exchange and collaboration between philosophers, especially phenomenologists and sports scientists. And it was also meant to investigate questions like burnout, if I remember that rightly, and to bring to bear the full analytic potential of phenomenology on practical issues, which is something I really appreciate very much, because I think that's the way, and that's the future of phenomenology. And yeah, I think body time also relates a bit already to the topic of the talk today. That will be a talk on Merleau-Ponty and on his notion of the flesh and on its implications for the questions we are pursuing here. Reinhold, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation, Michael and Franco. I'm very glad to be here with you in Ljubljana. I've prepared a handout. I think it's circulating. Okay. Does everybody have one? Okay. Okay.
There are some other people coming probably, so
yes. So my topic is the flash of creation, notes on Maurice Merleau-Ponty. The term of creation is a central theological concept for the three Abrahamic religions, that is for Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Of course, creation has been conceived differently in the respective religions and over time. In general, on the Christian side, the creatio ex nihilo is distinguished from the creatio continua. Creatio ex nihilo means that God's act of creation constitutes the term from nothing to something, although the idea of the simsum in Jewish thinking also addresses the problem of how something can exist except from or in God, provided that He is the only and the sole reality to be imagined. Despite these and other difficulties, it seems to be evident in which perspective the act of creation of God is conceived, namely as an occurrence of being. The concepts nothing and something or being derive from an ontological terminology, and this fact is made even more explicit by the second creation concept, by the creatio continua, essential to the Christian conception expressing God's ongoing activity, which is that God does not allow the world to revert to nothingness, but keeps it being and thereby makes sure that the world will last through time. This is again an ontological statement about God and his relation to the world. For the ontological interpretation of the concept of creation, also the long tradition of philosophical theology is characteristic. For example, the Thomas Aquinas philosophically comprehends God as the ipsum esse subsistens, which is the ground of the world's existence, and that the question of God within philosophy is assigned in ontology. In recent francophone phenomenology, the effort to think God otherwise than being was made by Emmanuel Levinas, who reflected creation no longer ontologically but ethically, that is, in the context of the other and the ego. The connection to creator and creature as relation due to which something is given existence, is no longer the center of attention. Rather, it is the created itself, which is under an ethical claim that emanates from the face of the other person and makes me permanently responsible for the other. Levinas thinks that we passively find ourselves in existence without having caused our own existence in an ontological sense. According to him, each person discovers furthermore an unthinkable beginning in the face of every other human being, which cannot be grasped ontologically, but has already made me responsible for him or her. God is not presented as the one who brings beings into existence, but as a trace in the face of the other person whom you can never capture. This situation radically transcends both phenomenology and ontology. Even if Merleau-Ponty takes an intellectual path different from Levinas, I think that the theology of creation can receive important impulses from his philosophy. That is why, in the following, I'll try to take up a central idea of his late philosophy and to examine how his concept of the radicalized body phenomenology, characterized by his concept of the flesh, could acquire meaning in terms of theology of creation. The frame of reference in this case remains an ontological one and is not abandoned in favor of an ethical one. However, Merleau-Ponty's conception of the flesh, if one reads it ontologically, contains a break with traditional ontology insofar as reality is not seen through materiality but through corporeality. Merleau-Ponty doesn't put the concept of life at the center of its reflections, as Michel Henry does when he speaks of incarnation, and he especially has an interest to reinterpret Christology. In contrast, Merleau-Ponty starts from the concept of the body, which in his late philosophy he extends to reality as a whole, by developing it to the concept of the flesh that grounds reality as a whole. Before applying Merleau-Ponty's ontology based on his concept of the flesh to the Christian idea of creation and deriving implications for theology, it is essential to analyze relevant passages of the visible and the invisible, and some of the lectures at the Collège de France on the nature. So first, nature and creation. In his dispute with René Descartes, Merleau-Ponty states that the recourse to the Christian idea of the infinite, which was applied to God, was fundamentally changed the understanding of the relationship between God and nature, and thus also between God and creation. Namely, nature had split into a natura naturans and a natura naturata, so that the world as natura naturata had lost the moment of the creative, which was reserved for God alone as natura naturans. Thus the earth was not only godless, but also degraded as a mere product, while God was no longer found in the world, but was elevated to the sole creator. As Christopher Ben Simpson rightly points out, with reference to Merleau-Ponty's collection of essays with the title Senior, Merleau-Ponty says the defiancy of such an idea of creation as acosmism. If creation is reduced to mere material, according to Merleau-Ponty, not only is God's immanence in the world lacking, but also the creative power of nature. Nature is only, as I told you, a natura naturata, but not a natura naturans anymore. The endeavor of Merleau-Ponty is opposed to this conception of nature, which in his opinion has to be induced by the Christian idea of creation, a philosophy of nature emanating from liveliness and wildness. In addition, with his concept of flesh, he highlights an ontology that recalls human corporeality and generalizes it to the flesh of reality. In this way, the ontological part of the conceptual relation between nature and creation is addressed. I mean that the concept of the flesh, if it is taken ontologically, sheds new light on the question of creation. With this thesis, I follow Andreas Nordlander, who maintained that this flesh may be addressed as creation, and I'll try first to highlight some moments of the term flesh of the late philosophy of Merleau-Ponty, important for an ontology of creation. So second, flesh as an ontological factor. According to Merleau-Ponty's further development of Husserl's phenomenological approach and his emphasis on corporeality, the question arises if he has only exchanged the concept of consciousness with that of corporeality. But such an insinuation does wrong to Merleau-Ponty, not only because it restricts him for his position, but also because already in his book Phenomenology of Perception, he wants to paralyze the constitutional consciousness and the subject to the body and the world, and not to replace it. Merleau-Ponty emphasizes the reciprocity of the subject and the world by asserting, quote, "The world is inseparable from the subject, but from a subject which is nothing but a project of the world. And the subject is inseparable from the world, but from a world which the subject itself projects." He adds that this point, that the subject with his tendency to transcend towards the world prefigures its form, namely the form of the world. In this period of his philosophy, Merleau-Ponty, although he imagines a unity between the I and the world, writes that the relationship is a skewed plane, since the world receives its final destination from the subject. Although he conceives the subject as bodily, Merleau-Ponty thinks that it constitutes the opposite in order to gain a relationship to it. Thus, constitution is indeed separated from the mere consciousness, because it is unthinkable without the body, but the so conceived subject determines the world to a greater extent than it itself is determined by the world. In his book, The Visible and the Invisible, and in the accompanying work notes, Merleau-Ponty seeks to overcome this asymmetry. He first points out that the visible body loses its own visibility just as little as the world being seen. This may seem strange because Merleau-Ponty assumes that the ability of seeing is part of the world non-alive too. To illustrate this, he refers to the experience of painters. These feel, as he believes, looked at by the things, so that the seer and the visible reciprocate one another, and we no longer know which sees and which is seen. So, end of the quote. What connects the two ear areas is the fact that they both are flesh. Merleau-Ponty asks rhetorically, quote, "Where are we to put the limit between the body and the world, since the world is flesh?" This phrase means that there's an intertwining, entrelac, between the world and the subject conceived as a body. However, the boundary between them doesn't blur because both were composed by the same matter, which would miss not only the concept of the body, but also the concept of the world. Nor is the world simply the body of the subject. If so, corporeality would be thoroughly misunderstood. Rather, Merleau-Ponty thinks of flesh as a principle of unity, not only of the consciousness and the body, so to say, not only within the ego, but also between the subject as a body and the world. He called this connection chiasm, which is characterized by the fact that the relation to see and to be seen is reversible. But how is flesh, which forms the reason of the mentioned chiasm, to be recognized more exactly? Merleau-Ponty doesn't think of a matter-mind dualism and moreover wants to overcome a substance ontology. Subjectivity and objectivity can no longer be clear because of the facts of chiasm and reversibility. They apply both to the person and to the world. Flesh is not matter, is not mind, is not substance, as Merleau-Ponty declares. Rather, he compares it with the concept of the element of early Greek philosophy and wishes flesh to be comprehended, quote, in the sense of a general thing in which the perception and the perceived cannot be distinguished yet. So flesh is not material that can be grasped empirically, but an ontological principle that logically precedes the subject-object division. Merleau-Ponty tries to define it as, quote, a sort of incarnate principle that brings a style of being wherever there is a fragment of being. The flesh is in this sense an element of being, end of quote. Flesh is understood here as a principle of being that is incarnating in everything and from which the difference between perception or knowledge on the one side and reality or world on the other side exclusively arises. But as a principle, it is not without purpose, but indicates the way in which a difference can arise from the flesh. For being is not equal to being, but each shape of to be has its own style, which is shown and realized in the concrete differentiation of the subject-object split. As the example of vision, which gave the title to the last book of Merleau-Ponty shows, the visible and the invisible come together in the flesh. However, their dissociation never takes place in the same way, but always happens newly and differently, and dictates how the appearance of the visible occurs. The visible is never completely visible, but remains invisible at the same time. The same thing takes place vice versa for the invisible. The visible and the invisible interpenetrate differently at any point, and their relationship is never determined in the same way. In his late philosophy, Merleau-Ponty does not only think of perception in the context of the flesh. Flesh is not only an element of cognition, but as mentioned above, also, quote, an element of being. That means that different dualisms in the flesh find a unity principle that already contains the two sides in the form of intertwining, and therefore is able to let them separate each other. This ontological principle of unity, however, is not an erratic block, but it is determined by chiasm, intertwining, being subsequent, duplication, and reversibility. That is, it is able to let differences emerge in different ways. The mode of such differentiation results in the different style to be, which is generated again and again. Third, Merleau-Ponty's view of creation. Before attempting to draw some conclusion from his ontology of the flesh for a Christian understanding of creation, I would like to outline Merleau-Ponty's general criticism of the concept of creation. This will demonstrate why Merleau-Ponty rejects the ontology that, in his opinion, determines the theological concept of creation. His criticism targets primarily 2 points, which he believes are wrong. On the one hand, he dislikes the already mentioned separation between natura naturans and natura naturata, which René Descartes carried out and which led to the elimination of the creative element in all the created. In his lectures at the Collège de France, he speaks of the fact that nature is no longer possesses an interior, but only represents the external realization of the rationality of God. For Merleau-Ponty, this means that the concept of creation allows nature to be recognized as a lawful system that enables the natural sciences to be based on a deterministic conception of nature. Quote, nature as a system of laws makes superfluous the presence of forces that are inward. The inwardness is completely in God. End of quote. That is why, according to Merleau-Ponty, Christian conception of creation and scientific determination go hand in hand. According to both complementary views, nature has no creative power in it, because all of it is reserved for God. In other words, Creator is only God, not the world, and God is not in the world, but strictly separated from it. As historically evidence that this interpretation of creation met resistance even within Christianity, Merleau-Ponty makes reference to the French worker priest who, in his judgment, wanted to show that God cannot be positioned exclusively outside the world. It's a cultural example and not the example of the natural sciences. On the other hand, Merleau-Ponty starts with his criticism of the term contingency. He conceives this one, as Nordlander worked out, in a double sense. On the one hand, it is the relative contingency of the world, through which the world is open to new sense and to the appearance of hitherto unknown meaning. This semantic contingency is contrasted with absolute contingency, which the world regards as being unnecessary in its existence, and which must be understood ontologically. Merleau-Ponty correlates both forms of contingency in such a way that an affirmation of divine creation as a response to the enigma of ontological contingency implies a denial of intramundane relative contingency. This is because a created world for Merleau-Ponty is a determinate world in which the pre-weighed natural laws make it impossible to shape reality as in a free way. Convinced, however, of the possibility of semantic creativity within the world, Merleau-Ponty, by implication, rejects the creation of the world by God. For the sake of semantic openness and freedom in the world, which cannot be described scientifically, he denies the creation of the world by God, according to Descartes' opinion, which was criticized by him. In his inaugural lecture, Éloge de la Philosophie, at the Collège de France on the 15th of January 1953, in which he deals with Henri de Lubac and Jacques Maritain and their Christian understanding of contingency, Merleau-Ponty introduces philosophy as a mode of thinking which must take a definite position against the theology of creation, because there, giving sense is reserved exclusively to God, for God. The contingency of the world and astonishment that there is anything at all have no other importance than to deduce an eternal being from it. Quote, for theology recognizes the contingence of human existence only to derive it from a necessary being, that is, to remove it. Theology makes useful of theological wonder only for the purpose of motivating an affirmation which ends it. End of quote. The strict rejection of the concept of creation stems in particular from the fact that Merleau-Ponty again grasps the implicit contingency as the word's determination and sees a creator God as a distraction from the creativity of the world. He contrasts the theological idea of creation with the philosophical esteem of a world that freely develops. Because of the creative dimension of reality, the contingency of the world must be recognized without misusing it for the derivation of a God of creation. However, this view of contingency seems to have changed in the visible and the invisible, and with the concept of the flesh presented there. Although Merleau-Ponty assigns the possibilities of creativity to the flesh, he also conceives it as an ontological approach. Now, semantic contingency is no longer excludes ontological contingency. In a word, what was previously absolutely contingent is now seen to be rooted in being. As the contingency of giving sense is no longer arbitrary or totally free, but is connected back to the ontological structure of the flesh, it is no longer absolutely optional or chaotic. Merleau-Ponty himself maintains in The Visible and the Invisible that the flesh of the world of my own is not contingency, chaos, but a texture that returns to itself and conforms to itself. End of quote. Moreover, according to a note from the 17th of January 1959, he doesn't want to think of the he doesn't want to think of the infinite as an idealized infinity beyond the world, but as an openness and as the infinite of the Lebenswelt. The infinity is now, as he says, meaning or reason which are contingency. Sans ou raison qui sont contingence. Contingency is no longer structurally or chaotically uncertain. Rather, it is now thought of as an ontological imprint and even identified with reason. The flesh itself has a structure that, although not determinate, provides a framework for meaning as a style and as a changing mode of being. Merleau-Ponty locates the flesh as an initial ontological determination, so to speak, between determinism and chaos, conceding the freedom of giving sense, but without allowing it to slip off into arbitrariness. Fourth and finally, consequences for the theology of creation. Initially, Merleau-Ponty defended contingency against the theological conception, which he thought would misunderstand the world as the determinism as completely indeterminate. Now, he develops this concept in the way that the flesh and the accompanying style of being have a basal structure. On the one hand, this opens a gap recognizing that the contingent world can also be thought of as created. For the world is no longer self-determined, but has ontological conditions. This predetermine its evolution. On the other hand, however, the Cartesian conception of creation, according to which every creativity is to be found in God alone, is further rejected. For the world, insofar as it is grounded in the flesh, is itself, according to Merleau-Ponty, creative. By following these considerations, the following formula is no longer out of range. The flesh as creation and the flesh as creative are the same. If one admits that Merleau-Ponty's late philosophy opens the door to creation, one must concede at the same time that the concept of creation that becomes relevant now must be different from the one he criticized. Because this one separated God from the world so that the world was not given its own creative power. Finally, I would like to take up a few moments of the ideas shaped Merleau-Ponty and to formulate some consequences for the Christian concept of creation. In doing so, I am not occupied by apologetic attempts, but want to emphasize the innovative force of his reflections. First of all, it has to be noticed that the concept of creation, according to Merleau-Ponty, would have to receive an incarnational moment. This doesn't mean that God is separate from the world, since creation is incarnated in Jesus Christ, and that in this way he overcomes the hiatus between transcendence and immanence, even though the second divine person was involved in creating the world. Rather, the incarnational element is already to be asserted for the creation itself, and not only for Christ. Beyond salvation history, the style of being in the world is always incarnational, that is, it is bodily. What Merleau-Ponty first of all pointed out for human corporeality and asserted beyond Husserl's constitutional activity of consciousness is that the concept of the flesh becomes a universally ontological determination that is a fundamental feature of every reality and always has been. The flesh of the world is indeed a principle of ontological unity, which already contains the difference in itself, because the opposites in it are not sublated in the Hegelian sense, but intertwined and mutually interpenetrative. Differences can arise which are ever new and which allow being to be carried out differently. Being proves to be creative because it never resembles in the repetition of its existence, but always performs differently and therefore is always new. Sense, not yet known, is generated again and again. The contingency of the created world doesn't only mean that it is possible not to be, but always to be different and new as well. In this sense, according to Merleau-Ponty, creation has to be reflected as incarnational right from the beginning. Secondly, the time of creation is to be considered. It cannot be asked further when the date of the creative act should be exactly estimated. But creation, in the view of Merleau-Ponty, must be thought of as eternal. Eternity doesn't mean that something lasts infinitely long, but that the world ever emerges anew from the same origin, which is not a past origin that could be historically distanced. In this sense, time is a Stiftung, as Merleau-Ponty maintains using a German term which he assumes from Husserl. In a work note from November 1960, he explains this idea in such a way that he, like the flesh, also perceives time as a chiasm and, as a consequence, states, quote, then past and present are ineinander, with a German term, each envelope, and that itself is the flesh. With this specification of time, the everyday distinction between past and present and their outcome from the inner time consciousness is exceeded. Time is not constituted, but takes carnally out of itself and is, so to speak, the genesis of the becoming explicit of the differences within the chiasm. The time conceived in this way prescribes a direction which is not the time arrow, but the style of the being's self-realization. Merleau-Ponty calls this time existential eternity, éternité existentielle. Consequently, the time of creation is existential eternity and not the time of consciousness. Thirdly, the idea of creatio continua also changes with this concept of time. It no longer primarily describes that the created is kept in existence and doesn't fall back into nothingness. Such a view of creation would once again ascribe all activity to God, while the world remains passive. In contrast, creatio continua has to be interpreted as the continuation of the created action of God by the world itself. The created is consequently not only open to new meanings attributed to it from outside, but in itself there can be found a moment of freedom that generates sense and gives rise to it. The idea of creatio continua is no longer a matter of describing that to be is to endure within time, but that the process of creation itself determines time permanently. That is why the adjective creative attains a transcendental meaning, admittedly not in the sense of Kant as a condition of the possibility of knowledge, but as a universal ontological quality which belongs to all beings. This provision doesn't only express that created nature doesn't cease to be natura naturans, but also asserts that reality as a whole remains creative at any time. For example, not only the emergence of new life, but also any work of art are founded and enabled by the flash of the Verb. Finally, it should be noted that Merleau-Ponty's approach opens a third way beyond the conventional concept of creation and the theory of evolution. Merleau-Ponty criticizes not only the Christian idea of creation, but also the theory of evolution. He argues that Darwin eliminates the creative force of the world, similar to a concept of creation that sees nature primarily subjected to its own laws. In his lectures on nature, Merleau-Ponty refers to Darwin's findings as reversed finalism, in which the determinations are, quote, as strictly prescribed as by finalism, end of quote. Merleau-Ponty is, as he says in a work note in 1960, not a finalist, but he is no Darwinist either. In my view, he tries to understand creativity as a transcausal event that cannot be recorded by laws, whether they are finalistic or not. The ongoing development of the world is rooted in a different ground of being, which he calls flesh. It helps that being achieves its own style, which contains a moment of freedom that neither the classical logic of creation nor Darwin's evolutionary logic can account for. The dispute between conventional creation theology and evolutionary biology is therefore idle and for nothing. What it is all about can only be rethought with the help of the ontology of the flesh. To me, these four impulses from the late philosophy of Merleau-Ponty seem to be essential for the ongoing theory formation concerning a Christian theology of creation. First, creation has to be recognized as incarnational right from the start. Second, its time property has to be conceptualized as existential eternity. Third, creativity has to be reformulated as a transcendental principle of the world. And fourth, and finally, the contrast between theology of creation and evolutionary biology seems to be obsolete on the basis of a new ontology. Perhaps Merleau-Ponty's considerations can be made useful for a new theology of creation, not for an ethical, but for an ontological one. But this ontological one is not metaphysical. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reinhold, for your inspiring talk. I think that brings in a completely new face to the discussions we have thus far embarked on. So the floor is open for question, remarks. Please go ahead. Please. Yes.
So you spoke of Merleau-Ponty as contributing towards a Christian theology of creation, but I noticed that two terms barely came up in your lecture, namely Christ and grace, right? So if creation is incarnational from the beginning, then what is the meaning of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, right? What is its meaning? Its uniqueness relative to the original act of creation, which most Christian theology, I think, would want to strongly distinguish. And second, how is grace still made possible in Merleau-Ponty's understanding of the flesh?
Thank you very much. I think that his considerations maybe the basis for interreligious philosophy. I think Jesus Christ is not as important as in former times, because when you say that incarnation is a central moment of creation itself, you have the problem as a Christ to say, what is the unique thing for Jesus Christ? I'm with you, but that's the problem for a Christian creation of theory of creation. But on the other hand, it's a chance to speak with the other religions, I think. There are two branches to go, and you have to decide what you want to. For grace, this is very important questions because of the relationship between grace and nature. I think grace should be understood in a different way. Grace doesn't suppose nature, in this sense, but grace is also an initial moment for creation itself. The theology of grace should be rethought in a new way, I think, but this is a strictly consequence of these considerations of Merleau-Ponty.
So I think is it still a Christian theology of creation that we've gotten Christ?
I think it's a theology of creation from the three religions of the Scripture.
Okay, we have one more second, and I see some others. Please, could you start?
When this dualistic idea of creator and created is kind of gone beyond or gone under in the concept of flesh and the idea of the elements. In how I read Merleau-Ponty's flesh, which is not very often done in academic field, is that I think that Merleau-Ponty's concept of the flesh, and then when you brought up that it kind of reinvigorates this kind of old elemental thinking of the Greeks. I think this came very strongly from the influence of Gaston Bachelard. Mm-hmm. And in academic literature, it's not very much pointed out. Lately, it has come a little bit more, and one of the reasons for this is that the visible and the invisible, of course, came posthumously out, and it's actually kind of a creation of Claude Lefort, who chose which notes were published. And there is so many of the notes which bring out the Bachelard's influence, which are not there. So these 4 books of the Bachelard, which thinks of the different elements and then the creation through the elements, I think this is one of the most interesting ways of starting to think going beyond this idea of the creator and the creative creation, because it's the elements which inspired for example, the poet or the painter. And also Merleau-Ponty quotes Cézanne of saying that it's the landscape that thinks itself within me, and then it's the artist's job is to bring that out. So this, I think, is one of the ways to start to really think what this connection of the creator and the creation is.
I think it's thank you for this hint. I think it's very important too to consider that art, for instance, art is also an ontological event. Because the artists, the painters and so on, they are not only seen by the nature, as he ever says, Merleau-Ponty ever says, but beyond of seeing, it's also an impulse of nature which is working in the artist, so that he's able to do his images. I think this is, if you do this ontology, there are a lot of consequences also for the philosophy of art and so on, of nature and so on.
James, you're next. Please.
What? So is it simply that the world is alive, that in this intertwining of self and world, and at that point, do we need God?
One question I asked for myself was, is Merleau-Ponty a Spinozist or not?
And your answer?
My answer was, I think he has a Spinozistic dimension, but the difference is, I think, that nature and the flesh are creative, but they are not distinct from the Verb, Spinozistic. And on the other hand, I think that that the Verb itself has a difference within it, and this is the intertwining. It's not the same. So if you have the substance of God and you have the appearance in the world, there are moments of God. I think that within the flesh there are different moments unified by intertwining. I think this is the difference. It's not the Verb is not a moment of God on God, but the differences are unified, but not in the unity of a block. But the unity of the flesh is only the unity of differentiation. Difference has to be reunified, otherwise it's, you can't think it. And on the other side, if you only have differences, you don't know the differences of what they are. And this would be my answer. There's a small path between Spinozism and not Spinozism for the late Merleau-Ponty, in my opinion.
Just a short remark to the discussion about creation and grace, then my question to you. Creation is already grace. Grace is earlier in a diachronic sense, because creation is the givingness of life to all creation. There's a universal salvation of God, the presence of God in the universal sense, according to Vatican II, Vatican Council II, is very clear. Creation is already grace. And also the time of Old or First Testament, the time of commitment, is in relation immediately to God, it's grace. So it's nearly clear from Catholic thinking. The other remark is, Reinhold, you told about the creation's time as existential eternity. And I don't know Merleau-Ponty, because of this my question. Is it because, like in Augustine, we can make the experience that we are, the whole life we are staying in our body, a space of our presence. And the presence is the remaining situation of our life. We are acting and talking to each other always in the form of the presence. And so Augustine could say that it's a permanent situation of presence, that if I begin to think about presence, then I don't get it. Then presence is fluently. It's always away. And so the presence is a permanent situation of my life. Is this the reason why Merleau-Ponty talks about an eternity? Because he knows the finiteness, that he takes the term of eternity. And what's the reason for this termination?
I think the outcome of time is the situation in which a subject and object go apart. And to live is always to be in this way of going apart. Here's the word, here I am. Here's the other person, here I am. This going apart in every new situation is the outcome of time, of the existential time. And this is, so to say, the time of life, and the time of life is an eternal life. Evidently, you can say this time of life is always embedded in another time, in one more time, the objective time, because I have been born and I'll die one day. But in the meantime, I have existential eternity because I have the time to live. But to live is for him, I think, always the situation of having a difference to the world, to the other persons.
Can there be a theology of decomposition in this framework? Or what kind of role might decomposition play in this theology of creation? Typically when we talk in theological terms about decomposition, we think in terms of degeneration, or sin, or sufferance, or death, which we bring upon ourselves through the elements of sin and fallenness. But in a following the original hope of looking at philosophy of creation and its applicability to a theology of creation, which is what you originally stated in the beginning. Is there a way to look at this idea of decomposition, which we know in biological terms is a necessary complement to any form of creation? Not just playing dialectics here, but just the sheer material of creation. So is there a way to think of the idea of decomposition within this theology of creation, or just a theology of decomposition?
I'd say that he has no theology of creation, Merleau-Ponty. But this is also the attempt for theologians to grasp after him and to do something like that. So I think Merleau-Ponty has done the decompositional work because he decomposes the former attitudes of understanding creation. Cartesian one, something like here is God and here is the Word, and there is a gap between them and so on. I think to show that this is not the only truth is the work of decomposition made by Merleau-Ponty himself. And so the theologians only have the possibility, if they want to do something with Merleau-Ponty, to have a term of creation which is already decomposited. Okay? Yes.
Yeah, the real exciting kind of prospects of your paper for me is how you might sort of think this in relationship to process thought, and then think about Alfred North Whitehead, or even sort of process theology, someone like Catherine Keller, who would make a distinction between the pantheism of Spinoza and panentheism, which maintains a space of difference. Right? So to me, sort of the whole, the theology of creation that you're sketching out, in which sort of nature has its own most kind of creative capacity, both sort of creative and destructive capacity, is very much in line with the kind of unfolding of creation that one gets from process thought. And I wonder if you've ever thought about this in connection with Whitehead, with process thought more generally, or is there something about that which is too pantheistic? Or?
I think that there are two relatives to that. It's Leibniz with his monad, and on the other side it's Whitehead, yes. Concerning Whitehead, I think that in Whitehead he says that the monads are open, and this is a system of giving and accepting the informations between the monads. I think that in Merleau-Ponty there's no situation of giving back something, but it's only the origin of being creative, not creative, of being creative. And so I don't think if there's a relationship anymore between the things within the world or between the creative things. They come up and they die, and the next will come up, and the next will die, and so on and so on. But between the first event and the second event, there's no interrelated influence, I think. That's, I think, the difference to Whitehead. And the difference to Leibniz, I think, is if the monads don't have windows, you have to have a structure, a fundamental structure, and this is the pre-stabilized harmony. And here, there is no harmony at all. But it is not only a freedom, as I wanted to say, but as it is flesh, it is a fundamental kind of structure in there. And so there's no harmony, but there's a little bit of structure. And because of there's no harmony at all for him, so that I could have a structure of the world, allowing to go back to the Creator God, I think this is the difference to Leibniz.
We have two final questions, I would say, so please be sharp, Emmanuel.
So thanks. I think it is a very fecund perspective to read Merleau-Ponty in that way. I just want to say that the situation today of Merleau-Ponty in French philosophy and in French phenomenology is absolutely special, in fact, because Merleau-Ponty is no more quoted by the French phenomenologists, I suppose, warning about Ricoeur, but about Merleau-Ponty, it is always like that. And if someone is speaking about Merleau-Ponty, for example, missionary, it is always to be against Merleau-Ponty. So, in what we call French phenomenology, or the theological term of French phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty completely disappeared. In a generation, not in mine, because I am completely Merleau-Pontian, Romano is completely Merleau-Pontian, Nathalie Deprat is completely Merleau-Pontian, Renaud Barbaras is completely... It means that the people who are now, I am about 50 or more, we are Merleau-Pontian, but we don't want to say it too high. As Jean-Luc, Jean-Luc Chrétien are Heideggerian, in fact. But we discover now that we are Merleau-Pontian. And why we discover? Because there's a concourse in France, the aggregation, and all of us, we have to study a lot Merleau-Ponty when I was 25 or something like that. The second point is, probably you know Renaud Barbaras, but when Renaud was the first philosopher who studied Merleau-Ponty in France, his PhD, the first PhD on Merleau-Ponty, he wanted to try to find a supervisor, but it was absolutely impossible. He asked to 5 teachers, and they said, no, he's a poet. He's not a philosopher. So that is very important to understand the thing. The second point, why Merleau-Ponty is very interesting for us today, even in philosophy of religion. It is because Merleau-Ponty is absolutely not in the same situation, for example, as Heidegger or as Sartre. Why? Because Merleau-Ponty is absolutely not against Christianity, first, and is coming from Christianity. Because if you know the story of Merleau-Ponty, his family, he went to the Mass, his father was having a very good French family. Okay. Then, when he arrived at the École Normale, he met Sartre and so on, and then he said, okay, I don't need the hypothesis of God anymore. It is exactly what happened now, for example, in France, for many people, and even sometimes some of my children. I'm not against, but I don't need it. What I call the coherent atheism, which is not virulent atheism. So that is a very interesting point to say. What does it mean to discuss about theology with someone who is not against me? Because I think when you say that, Merleau-Ponty, if you were there, you say, oh, what do you say? It's incredible, you can't speak about my philosophy as a theology. He will say, okay, I know theology, and he spoke about transubstantiation in the case of creation. He said, as the world became flesh, and so on. So why not? But he said, it's not my way. So it's interesting to know, he will say, it's not my way, but I'm not against your way. It means that if you do that, you can do it. I think Merleau-Ponty will be agree with that. Then the last point is the question, of course, can we say in theology that creation is incarnation? It is a very interesting point. I think that first, as you said, the concept of creation is not in Merleau-Ponty except in an aesthetic perspective with Cézanne and so on. So I think it could be very good to do the same work with Cézanne on the question of creation. And then I think that in the Father of Church, I'm thinking about Irenaeus, you could say exactly that incarnation is creation. But then, when you said creativity has to be reformulated as a transcendental principle of the world, if you do that, you are not Merleau-Pontian anymore. So the question is, okay, because I'm a theologian, now I'm not Merleau-Pontian, or can you say that if I am a Merleau-Pontian, there is no more God who is up and me who is down? When you say that, you stay always in a no-Merleau-Pontian conception in which you are thinking that there is the earth and it's not true. And in theology too. Because in theology, if I follow Bonaventure or Balthazar, you can't say that there is God and the earth, but the earth and we are in the sun. So in God, so there is not two words. Well, it's a long remark.
Yeah. Thank you very much. For the first remark, my answer to the first long remark is, I'm not French, but I'm 50 years old in class.
Yes,
So it's the same thing.
I know, I see that. But it's very interesting to see that.
The second point is, I think to say that to be creative is a transcendental thing of the world is transcendental in the old sense of the Middle Ages. Verum, bonum, pulchrum, to be creative. This would be an inner to distinguish ontology is also possible by saying it is creative, as it is possible to say it is truth. In this sense, I would like to understand this.
Okay, I think we only have a couple of minutes to change the sessions, but just to conclude, and I don't ask a question, I simply give you the bone of contention because it haunted me during your presentation.
Merleau-Ponty, when he talks about flesh, also talks about the kind of sublime flesh, the Word. The Word, not the world. So there's the flesh of the world, and there's the flesh to which the flesh migrates. And my question would have been, what role does language and the Word play in that kind of...
I think very important, because it begins with language and comes to the flesh. In the way of the thinking, I think this is the way. He begins with the language and the sublime, and then he comes to the ontological.
Okay. Anyway, let me thank you, Reinhold. Thanks.